My name is Leib.
I'm Jonathan Cohen.
I'm Isabella Hazan.
I'm Shayna.
We're from Herzliah High School, Montreal, Quebec. And today we're going to be presenting sitting in a half circle, because this year in Talmud class we learned that the Sanhedrin used to sit in a chetzi or a half circle, so that everybody could hear and see each other.
Hashem has bestowed a beautiful gift upon humanity. It is the one common force within every living being. We have been given full authority and independence to act with it as we wish. Welcome to our Beit Din de Breyer.
To what extent must we go to save a life while taking into account the risk of endangering it?
Good question, Rabbi Leib. We know that Leib is in his shop, but is he a grossesse?
No. Il n'est pas un grossesse. Absolutely not. As we'll prove later on. But, Rabbi Yohana, would you mind please re-explaining Chayesha?
Chayesha is the amount of time that a dying patient has left to live. The sources clearly explain how to deal with Chayesha. The first source states that if one's life is in jeopardy, then we are lo chashina, we are not concerned with Chayesha. The second source states that we can sacrifice our Chayesha, provided that we can extend the lifespan of the patient, so long as we are not subjecting him to additional suffering, of course.
Let's start by discussing option B.
Allow me. Option B entails the high probability that Leib's intra-aortic balloon pump will fail within a week. Until then, we are exposing him to many fatal risks, such as gastrointestinal bleeding. Our sages would strongly oppose putting Leib through such a level of pain. I think we should oppose this option for the following reasons. Firstly, the passage quoted in Sanhedrin, Lo tamod adam be'echa, is a strong objection to this point. Labels anyone who has the power to heal another and refrains from doing so as a bloodshedder. Yichot Moshe stands by the fact that any God-fearing person must heal and save by any means possible.
Rabbi Cohen, we must not forget that halacha dictates that the Shabbat cannot be desecrated under any circumstance, except for the case brought down by the Torah, which states that in the case of pikuach nefesh, saving a life, one is both allowed and obligated to transgress the Shabbat, as in the case of removing of the rubble in Yom Av.
Also, the Gemara in Avodah Zarah points out that we are not concerned, lo chayshina lo chayesha, in the case that death is a certainty, as portrayed in the permission to go to a non-Jewish doctor, and in the case of the 4 lepers deciding to attack Machaneh Aram. In both cases, the patient and the lepers were facing certain death, so they became justifiable in attempting desperate courses of action that they shouldn't even have considered otherwise. Tosafot Avodah Zarah adds that we must choose the possibility of life over certain death.
And we must not forget, Tosafot, that states that we must act in the patient's best interest, with Torato. We cannot fathom that option B is Torato, as Leib has other viable options. Notwithstanding that he will remain sedated, Minchat Shlomo places a considerable burden upon us to relieve a patient's pain, regardless as to whether or not he is aware of it.
I absolutely agree with you, Rabbi Yohana. Considering the above reasons that we cannot stand by idly, we must go as far as desecrating the Shabbat, choosing life over certain death, and looking out for the patient's best interest. We cannot leave Leib in his current state.
So, it's settled. Option B is off the table. Next up, option C, the removal of the IABP. This option gives Leib a 50% chance of surviving a month and a high probability of dying within a few months. If we were to choose option C, we have to define how one must deal with the grossesse. The following 2 rules clearly describe a patient in its very final moments.
The first rule is the fact that it is forbidden to touch and or move a grossesse, as this can accelerate his death. It is known as the active approach. It is portrayed by 2 examples: shutting a pillow from underneath the grossesse, or placing synops underneath his head. The second rule states that we must allow the neshama of the grossesse to leave independently by removing an impediment or an obstacle to death, known as a maniya or me'akef. It is known as the passive approach, and is also portrayed by 2 examples: putting an end to the nearby banging noise of a wood chopper, or the removal of a grain of salt from the grossesse's tongue.
The literal meaning of the words passive and active is of lesser importance. Rather, we must make the distinction between doing something that would accelerate the exit of the neshama, which is forbidden, as opposed to allowing it to leave independently by simply removing an obstacle, which is permitted.
With regards to option C, our Beit Din must consider the risk that the operation entails and the degree of suffering that our patient will endure. In order to ensure that his suffering is minimized, Leib's condition will be medically managed. Rabbi RAVSAK states that where there is much pain and no hope for a real cure, a patient can refuse to undergo the medical treatment in question.
And we must not forget that Rabbi Brody states that we should not try to convince a patient to agree with surgery that has very minimal chance of curing a growing tumor. we actually find a few sources which would oppose taking any unnecessary risks, such as Rabbi Weisner, who proposes that we may choose to avoid fear, risk, and pain when we do so in the interest of the remaining moments of life. This rationale was laid out by these sources. They all state that one may not cause his own death. However, if one reaches a point where his mind is oppressive to him, or that his mental condition is deteriorated to a point of no return, as in the cases of the elders Ruz, or in the case of the Kali Khanami Te'ajan, there seems to be a consensus that we can apply the passive approach of allowing the neshama to depart independently.
I believe it is safe to say that the active equivalent would be subjecting Leib to complex treatments. Undergoing these procedures may produce the same result of precipitating the exit of the neshama. On the other hand, the passive approach could be equivalent to a palliative type of medical treatment, where we provide the patient with maximum comfort while minimizing his pain. Consequently, when the final moments arrive, we can simply coordinate the treatment in order to allow the proper and timely exit of the soul.
Rabbi Tazan, I couldn't agree more. Option C is halachically permissible.
Certainly permissible. Now, let's examine the final option.
We must hurry. Time is of the essence. Shayna is waiting for our decision.
Option A, the bypass operation, presents the highest risk to Leib's Chayesha, being a 30% probability that he will die during the procedure. Important rulings essential to our discussion today, which would allow us to take a 30% risk are those of Rabbi Jactor, quoting Mishnah Chachamim, as well as Shuvah Tzitz Eliezer, which permit risky surgery for people with only 6 months left to live. Rav Arna's opinion is that it is permissible to risk one's remaining life in order to extend it.
Proceeding with the operation means they could die on the operating table. However, should the operation succeed, he could live for many, many more years. Granted, he would remain with his Alzheimer's condition, but by definition, there is no real physical pain associated with Alzheimer's, and the Yehud Moshe clearly states that someone who is mentally incompetent or has Alzheimer's, as in our case, must be saved and healed by any means possible. Finally, if one was opposed to risking 1 week of Chayesha under option B, or 1 month of Chayesha under option C, we must consider the ruling by Rabbi Chaim Ozer, who claims that there is no conceptual distinction between a day or two as opposed to 6 months of Chayesha.
Option A. Eliminate his current condition from his suffering from the current heart condition.
Extends his lifespan while taking an acceptable and calculated risk to his Chayesha.
It ensures there's no further suffering over and above his Alzheimer's condition.
And it gives him the possibility of living out his remaining years.
Rabbi Cohen, the verdict.
Our Beit Din rules that option B is halachically prohibited, option C is halachically permissible, and option A is both halachically permitted and obligated, and indisputably Shayna had an option.
To that.
Good job, first of all. So you mentioned, if I understand correctly, B would be forbidden, A and C would both be permissible, with you recommending A as the best course of action. One of the issues that you brought into play was this issue of pain, and that pain is a part of this conversation. At what level does that enter into the conversation in recommending option A as the one which you would recommend as the strongest option? Say that again? You can, but I think you only have 8 minutes here or so.
So you asked as to whether or not we consider risk while choosing option A? Is that just
And whether you mentioned pain as a reason why that's one reason to rule out B. But what about the issue of pain in option A?
So we believe that the entire structure of our case is based off 2 questions. Number one, to take a calculated risk, and to really establish the degree of suffering that the patient will have to endure under whichever option we choose, right? Under option B and C, under option B particularly, we said that the degree of suffering is way too high, and regardless as to whether or not he's aware of it, as Minchas Shlomo says, we heal the patient regardless as to whether or not he's aware of his pain. The thing in option A is that based on what we know of the case, although we can't really go into the intricacies of a specific heart surgery that we don't know exactly what the outcome might be in terms of pain, we know we can establish through the sources of the contemporary rabbis who were able to apply the thinking of the Gemara to today's ethical and biochemical issues, we are able to determine, based on the case and based on the sources, that the risk is, and the pain and the risk are both calculated and acceptable.
Can you just clarify for me, you quoted Rabbi Auerbach for option C. I forget which one of you was speaking at the time, I apologize. Can you just go back and clarify how Rabbi Auerbach's position contributes to your conclusion about option C?
Auerbach's opinion is that it is permissible to risk one's remaining life in order to extend it.
We stated in our case that Rabbi Auerbach states in source 19 in the source book that where there is much pain and no hope for a real cure, a patient can refuse to undergo the medical treatment in question. So that's just
Okay, so how did you just connect it again back to case option C for me?
So to connect that he may refuse to undergo the medical treatment, but we have to remember that he is, I guess, incompetent to make decisions for himself. Shayna thereby becomes his, I guess, legal decision maker. And so to reiterate, the source says that he is, the specific word. Right. So there's much pain and little hope for real cure. The patient can refuse to undergo the treatment in hand. In this case, there is much pain because how we built the argument is going from B to C to A. We are considering all the factors first on B from a logical perspective, doing nothing, then C doing a bit, and then from A doing a lot. Moving up on that sort of ladder, we saw that under option C, there's a certain amount of risk, but you can refuse to undergo any other more dangerous procedures than, for example, the A. But basically, simply said, is that we've decided that we can establish an active and passive approach with regards to C, right? We said that C is a passive approach, therefore it's permissible, and A, being sort of procedures, wouldn't be permissible. Later on, we proved that A could be permissible even though it's active, based off what contemporary rabbis have to include and their perspectives on the situation.
And why would you think C is permissible if essentially you know he's going to die? It's just prolonging the process.
So, in fact, we think that B is for sure off the table, it's prohibited, but C, we're not saying that it's the best option, we're just saying that we're not standing there and doing nothing. A person's about to die, we're doing something to actively treat his situation, and we're not just staying there and doing nothing. So even though option C is not the best option, the case asks us to state what options are permissible. So halachically, option C is permissible for the sources that we have stated, but option A would be the best option because we are actually making a change in his life. And we agree that option C isn't doing that.
So I have a follow-up question. You mentioned both in your writing and then also talking here the idea of the process, and it's hard to determine, some sources determine a time frame and some don't. So do you think it's possible to assume that a process in our day and age could be considered terminally ill or something in that realm? If that is possible, how does or does that not play into your decision making?
A very important aspect of this case, and it's probably one of the most central concepts of this case, is making a distinction between what a process is and what chayesha is. You see somebody who's terminally ill. Somebody who's terminally ill means there's a certain amount of time left in his life, right? We consider that to be what is chayesha. If we were to look at the sources who speak about a process, they literally specify to the point where if you were to remove a grain of salt from a process's tongue, place a pillow underneath his head, he would die. A person who's terminally ill, God forbid, with some kind of illness, shoving a pillow from underneath his head or something like that wouldn't generally cause him to die. A process is not somebody who has a certain amount of time left to live. It's a person who is in the process of dying. I think we say in our factum that we can assume, just based on the sources, we can assume that this amount of time could be maybe 24 hours, 2-3 days. It's something that is so close to death that there's almost no point of return. A simple analogy is a cliff, and a person standing on the cliff, right? So long as he doesn't jump off, he still has options to go back. He can still turn back and go back home, as is the case for Leib. He's standing on the cliff right here, and he has the choices of A, going back and taking the surgery, or B, doing nothing, or C, going back and being medically managed. Once he jumps off the cliff, he officially becomes a gosses. We can no longer help him, it's out of our control. We could, I guess, medically manage and make the situation better, but once he's a gosses, halacha clearly dictates that our specific rules apply to gosses to the point where we can't even interact. As in, we only take him out of the room if it's being burnt.
So how do you deal with that nuance then, in that he potentially could be considered in that state, leaving the IABP in, and yet you're considering taking him out of that state.
So in that case, we sort of made a correlation with the violation of Lot Madam Lecha. By letting him become a gosses, once he is a gosses, we are no longer liable for letting him die with Lot Madam Lecha. If he's not a gosses and we permit him to become a gosses, we are therefore standing by letting him become a gosses, and then thereby using the domino effect letting him die. So before he becomes a gosses, letting him become a gosses, from our perspective and our understanding of Lot Madam Lecha, falls under that prohibition of letting someone die doing nothing.
I'm sorry, I know you're very limited on time, but why wouldn't that then be true for option C?
Because in option C, at no point in time does he become a gosses, only at the end of time when his soul is about to depart, that's when he becomes a gosses. We are going to be medically managing him, making his situation favorable, and we're going to be minimizing his pain, giving him, I guess, medicine. It's not as though we're just standing by and doing nothing. And I think you pointed out earlier on that we're just letting him die out in C. Technically speaking, we're not. The case specifically says it's a high probability of him dying, but it's not for sure. And on top of that, we'd be medically managing him. We're making an attempt at his life. It's not like we're saying, hands on the table, it's done. We're making an attempt. We're not going over and above. That's not that.
Thank you.
Thank you.